Although not a common behavior, grizzly bears can play dead, primarily as a defensive tactic when threatened by hunters. In some cases, however, a bear may spring an attack after feigning death. One such incident occurred when a hiker was deceived by a grizzly pretending to be dead, an encounter she later deeply regretted. Join us as we recount the full story. The Montana wilderness was a land of extremes, where beauty and peril coexisted equally. Towering peaks loomed over dense forests, and glacial rivers carved deep scars through the valleys. It was a place where solitude could heal or shatter the soul. Grace Calder, a seasoned hiker in her early 30s, sought the former. The forest was her escape, a refuge from the demands of city life. With her gear packed and her route meticulously planned, she ventured into the wilderness one early October morning, eager for days of tranquility and self-discovery. Her trail was remote, a rugged path that wound through dense pine forests and led to a secluded alpine lake. Grace was no stranger to the risks. She carried bear spray, a whistle, and a GPS beacon. Her pack had food, water, and a compact first aid kit. She knew the importance of respecting the wild, of keeping her distance from its creatures. But no amount of preparation could have accounted for what lay ahead. After 3 days of hiking, Grace reached the high meadows, where autumn's palette painted the landscape in fiery shades of gold and red. She paused to take in the view, the crisp air stinging her lungs. It was here, in this idyllic setting, that the first sign of trouble emerged. A musky scent lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable, grizzly territory. She adjusted her route, veering away from the thick undergrowth that bore signs of recent activity. Claw marks on tree trunks and fresh scat scattered near berry bushes. Grace knew the rules. Avoidance was the best defense, so she moved cautiously, keeping her steps deliberate and her senses sharp. Still, the wilderness held its secrets, and some dangers could not be seen until too late. The encounter came suddenly. When she saw it, she had just descended into a small clearing surrounded by dense pines, a massive grizzly over 8 feet tall on its hind legs. The bear had emerged from the shadows, its deep-set eyes locking onto hers. Its fur was dark and shaggy, flecked with dirt and moss. The animal exuded power, every muscle taut with tension. For a moment, neither moved. Then, the bear began to huff, snapping its jaws and swaying its head. A clear warning. Grace froze, adrenaline surging through her veins. She reached for her bear spray, her fingers trembling as she unhooked the safety. The bear's growls deepened a low rumble that resonated in her chest. She knew the signs. The bear was agitated, perhaps defending a nearby kill or cubs. Slowly, she backed away, her eyes never leaving the animal. But before she could retreat far, the bear did something unexpected. It dropped to the ground and lay still. Grace's mind raced. Was it a bluff? She had heard of bears feigning submission, but this behavior seemed different. The bear's massive body lay limp, its breathing shallow. Confusion mixed with a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the threat had passed. Maybe it was injured or disinterested. Minutes passed, and the forest grew eerily silent. Tension began to ease, and curiosity took hold. Keeping the bear spray in hand, Grace took a cautious step forward, then another. She maintained a wide arc around the bear, her boots crunching softly against the frost-covered grass. The animal remained motionless, its eyes closed. Her rational mind warned her to keep moving, but her instincts faltered. She needed to be sure. When she was within 10 feet of the bear, it happened. With a speed that defied its size, the grizzly exploded into motion, launching at her with a guttural roar. Its claws struck her with the force of a sledgehammer, knocking her to the ground. The bear loomed over her, its breath hot and foul, its teeth bared in a terrifying snarl. Grace screamed, a primal sound torn from deep within her. Her survival instincts kicked in. She sprayed the bear directly in the face, the peppery mist enveloping its head. The bear recoiled, shaking its head violently, but its fury was undeterred. It lunged again, pinning her beneath its weight. Grace fought with every ounce of strength, kicking and clawing at its face. Her pack, still strapped to her back, absorbed some of the blows, but the bear's claws tore through fabric and flesh alike. Blood seeped into the earth as she struggled, the pain searing and all-consuming. In a desperate move, she reached for a fallen branch and struck the bear across its snout. The bear roared in pain but did not relent. It clamped its jaws around her shoulder, its teeth sinking deep. Grace screamed again, her vision blurring with tears and shock. The bear shook her like a rag doll before releasing her and stepping back. For a moment, it stood over her, its breath heaving, its fur matted with her blood. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the bear turned and disappeared into the woods. Grace lay motionless, her body a mosaic of cuts, bruises, and torn flesh. Pain pulsed through her in waves, but her mind clung to one thought: survival. She fumbled for her GPS beacon, her hand slick with blood, and activated it. The device emitted a faint beep, a lifeline in the vast expanse of wilderness. Hours passed. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, her screams having faded into the stillness of the forest. When the rescue team arrived following the beacon signal, they found her crumpled in the clearing, barely alive. Her clothes were shredded, and her body was a testament to the ferocity of the attack. Yet her chest rose and fell, stubbornly defying the odds. The medics worked quickly, stabilizing her before airlifting her to the nearest hospital. There, surgeons worked through the night to repair the damage. Her left shoulder was dislocated, her ribs fractured, and her torso lacerated. Infection was a constant threat, but Grace's will to live was stronger. Days turned into weeks, but as she recovered, each scar remained as a reminder of her ordeal. The Alaskan wilderness was a place of raw beauty and challenge, with its towering mountains and vast forests. For Elias Harrow, a father in his late 30s, it was an opportunity to teach his son, Owen, about resilience and nature. After months of planning, their hiking trip along a remote river trail near a national park was set to be an unforgettable adventure. Owen, only 10 but already curious about the wild, had been learning the essentials: tracking animal signs, identifying edible plants, and understanding the importance of respecting nature's boundaries. With his bright red jacket and a backpack nearly as large as he was, he eagerly followed his father's lead. Elias, a former park ranger, felt confident in their preparedness. He carried bear spray on his belt, a survival knife, and a sense of control that only experience could provide. But the Alaskan wilderness, for all its beauty, was never predictable. It was early afternoon when they reached a shallow riverbank. The sun glinted off the water, its steady gurgle harmonizing with the rustle of leaves. Owen crouched to inspect a cluster of stones, while Elias studied the surroundings. The land was rich with life: moose tracks by the water's edge and bald eagles soaring high above. However, the faint scuff marks in the dirt and tufts of dark fur caught on a low branch gave Elias pause. Bear signs. Elias gestured for Owen to stay close as they continued along the trail. The forest thickened, the dense canopy filtering sunlight into scattered patches. The river remained within earshot, a comforting presence amid the silence. But as they turned a bend, the tranquility shattered. Ahead, less than 30 yards away, stood a black bear with 2 cubs. Startled by their sudden appearance, the bear rose on its hind legs, its eyes fixed on the intruders. At full height it was massive, its dark fur glinting like polished obsidian. The cubs scurried behind their mother, mewling nervously. Elias froze, his instinct taking over. He placed himself between Owen and the bear, raising his arms to appear larger. He shouted, the sound reverberating through the trees. The bear hesitated, dropping back to all fours but still posturing aggressively. It huffed, pawed the ground, and swayed its head. Classic signs of a defensive charge. Owen clutched his father's jacket, his small frame trembling. Elias tried to edge backward, motioning for his son to follow, but retreating too quickly was risky, and the bear's agitation grew with each second. It roared a guttural sound that filled the air and then lunged. The bear closed the distance with terrifying speed, its bulk moving like a freight train. Elias barely had time to react before it crashed into him, knocking him to the ground. The impact drove the air from his lungs, and pain erupted in his side as the bear's claws raked through his jacket. He instinctively kicked out, trying to shield his head and torso, but the bear was relentless. Its jaws snapped inches from his face, saliva flying as it growled. Owen screamed, a piercing primal sound that cut through the chaos. The bear's head whipped around, its attention shifting to the boy. For a moment, Elias's heart stopped. He could see the animal's predatory instincts flicker to life, its muscles coiling as it prepared to charge the smaller, weaker target. Fueled by desperation, Elias reached out unquestioningly, his hand closing around a thick branch lying in the dirt. With all his strength, he swung it upward, kicking the bear on its snout. The animal roared in pain and surprise. Rearing back, Elias scrambled to his knees, adrenaline surging through his battered body. He struck again, aiming for its face, each blow fueled by the thought of protecting his son. The bear stumbled, shaking its massive head, but it wasn't finished. It swiped at Elias, claws raking across his forearm and sending the stick flying. Blood dripped onto the forest floor, but Elias didn't falter. He positioned himself between the bear and Owen again, arms spread wide, roaring as loud as he could. The bear hesitated, its nostrils flaring. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a final snarl, the bear turned and lumbered into the underbrush, the cubs following close behind. Elias collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving. His arm throbbed, and blood soaked through his torn jacket. Owen rushed to his side, tears streaking his dirt-smudged face. Elias pulled him close, wincing but relieved beyond words. They were alive. Elias knew they couldn't linger. His injuries were severe, and they were miles from the nearest help. He fashioned a makeshift bandage for his arm using a strip of fabric torn from his undershirt. He checked Owen for injuries. Miraculously, the boy was unharmed, though shaken. Together, they began the grueling trek back toward the trailhead, with Elias leaning heavily on his son for support. Hours later, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, they reached a clearing where Elias activated his emergency beacon. The wait felt endless, the cold seeping into their bones as they huddled together for warmth. When the faint hum of helicopter blades finally broke the silence, relief washed over them like a tidal wave. Rescuers descended, their faces a mixture of concern and admiration as they assessed the situation. Elias was airlifted to the nearest hospital, where doctors worked quickly to clean and stitch his wounds. His arm required surgery to repair deep muscle damage, and he suffered cracked ribs and multiple bruises. Yet his injuries were deemed non-life-threatening, a testament to his sheer willpower and the quick actions that had saved both his and Owen's lives. As they recovered in the hospital, rangers visited to debrief them on the encounter. Elias shared the details, emphasizing the bear's protective instincts rather than aggression. He hoped the incident would remind others of the unpredictable nature of wildlife and the importance of preparedness. In the following days, the story spread, a harrowing tale of survival in the unforgiving wilderness. Owen, though shaken, spoke proudly of his father's bravery. For Elias, the scars would serve as a lasting reminder of the fragility of life and the fierce love that had driven him to fight against impossible odds. Yellowstone wilderness stretched beneath a gray October sky, its rugged mountains, dense pine forests, and golden meadows stark against the approaching winter. Jonas Cade, a 41-year-old hunter with years of experience, had chosen this remote area for its abundance of elk preparing for migration. But along with the elk came more unpredictable and dangerous creatures. Jonas prided himself on his hunting prowess. His trusted .308 Winchester rifle gleamed under the faint sunlight as he carried it over his shoulder. His pack had all the essentials: survival gear, food rations, a sturdy knife, and a sidearm. He had set up camp near a game trail he knew elk frequented, a secluded spot by a stream that trickled through a grove of aspens. The crisp air carried the faint scent of pine and decay, the forest alive with the rustle of squirrels and the occasional distant bugle of an elk. He rose early that morning, the frost crunching under his boots as he set out to scout the area. The previous day, he had spotted fresh elk tracks leading into a dense thicket about a mile from his camp. He followed the trail with quiet precision, his every movement deliberate, his senses heightened. The forest felt unusually silent, a heavy stillness that he attributed to his proximity to prey. But Jonas knew the woods well enough to sense something was off. The hairs on his neck stood on end, a primal warning he couldn't quite ignore. As he emerged into a clearing, he stopped abruptly. There, about 30 yards away, was a grizzly bear. Not just any bear, but a massive sow, her shoulders rippling with muscle as she dug into the earth. Beside her, 2 cubs played, tumbling over one another with the oblivious energy of youth. Jonas's breath caught. A mother bear with cubs was the most dangerous animal in the forest. He froze, his mind racing. The sow hadn't seen him yet, but her nose twitched, catching the faint trace of his scent. Her head rose, and their eyes met. In that instant, the bear's demeanor changed. She stood on her hind legs, towering over the brush, her dark eyes narrowing in warning. Jonas knew better than to run. Grizzlies could easily outrun the fastest human. He began to retreat, moving backward slowly, keeping his rifle ready but not raising it. The bear huffed a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down his spine. Then she dropped to all fours and charged. The speed of the attack was shocking. The bear covered the distance between them in seconds, her massive frame crashing through the underbrush like a freight train. Jonas raised his rifle and fired, but the shot went wide, the bullet thudding uselessly into a tree. Panic surged as he fumbled to chamber another round, but there was no time. The bear was on him. She hit him with the force of a battering ram, her claws raking across his chest as she knocked him to the ground. The impact drove the air from his lungs, and pain exploded through his body. Jonas tried to raise his rifle again, but the bear swatted it away, sending it skidding into the dirt. He reached for his knife, a sturdy blade he kept strapped to his belt, and slashed at the bear's shoulder. The blow was shallow, barely enough to draw blood, but it enraged her further. The sow reared up, her claws slicing through his jacket and into his arms as he tried to shield his face. Each strike was like being hit with a barbed club, tearing through flesh and muscle. Blood soaked his clothes, and his vision blurred as pain threatened to overwhelm him. He struck again with the knife, this time driving the blade into the bear's side. She roared so loud and primal that it seemed to shake the ground beneath them. The bear bit down on his forearm, her teeth puncturing deep into the bone. Jonas screamed, the sound ripping from his throat as he twisted desperately, trying to free himself. He managed to shove the knife into her neck, a desperate, clumsy stab that made her release him for a brief moment. She backed off, shaking her massive head, blood dripping from the wound. Jonas used the reprieve to crawl away, dragging himself across the dirt toward the cover of the trees. His chest heaved, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the warm, sticky wetness of his blood pooling under him, the pain searing through his entire body. The bear paced a few feet away, huffing and pawing at the ground. She might charge again momentarily, but then she turned and lumbered back toward her cubs. The attack was over, but Jonas knew his fight for survival had just begun. Every movement sent agony lancing through him, but he forced himself onward, inch by inch, until he reached the tree line. He leaned against the trunk of a pine, his vision swimming. The forest spun around him, the world reduced to the thudding of his heartbeat and the burning pain in his chest and arms. By some miracle, he made it back to his camp. His tent was a blur of nylon and shadow as he collapsed inside, fumbling for his satellite phone with trembling hands. He managed to send out a distress signal before the darkness closed in. Hours later, the rescue team found him barely clinging to life. His clothes were shredded, and the bear's claws and teeth tore apart his chest and arms. Blood loss and shock had pushed him to the brink, but his heart still beat stubbornly. The medics worked quickly, stabilizing him before airlifting him to the nearest hospital. Surgeons spent hours repairing the damage, stitching torn flesh, and setting broken bones. Infection was a constant threat, and the road to recovery was long. Jonas would carry the scars for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of his encounter with the wild. Though he had survived, Jonas's relationship with the wilderness was forever changed. Once a place of triumph and freedom, the forest had become a realm of raw, unforgiving power. He understood now that even the most experienced hunter was no match for nature's apex predators. The grizzly, protective and primal, reminded him of a truth he had long taken for granted. Survival was never guaranteed out there. The remote wilderness of British Columbia stretched endlessly, an untouched expanse of towering evergreens, shimmering lakes, and jagged mountain peaks. Every corner seemed alive, from the gentle rustle of leaves to the distant cry of a loon echoing across the lake. The kind of solitude inspired awe and demanded respect, a domain ruled by nature in its rawest form. Jonas Harker and Lila Voss had been drawn to this isolated haven in search of escape. Newly engaged and seasoned adventurers, they had decided to celebrate their bond with a week-long camping trip by a pristine lake miles away from civilization. Jonas, a lanky man with wiry strength, had been coming to these woods since childhood. Lila, shorter and robust, shared his passion for the outdoors, but needed to gain his long experience with wilderness survival. Together, they made an excellent team, blending preparation and adaptability. Their campsite sat on a small ridge overlooking the glassy surface of Inkled Lake in the early morning light. A fire crackled softly, its warm glow casting gentle hues against the growing dawn. The smell of pan-fried trout, freshly caught from the lake, mingled with the crisp scent of pine. Everything felt perfect. The first sign of trouble was subtle, almost imperceptible. The birds fell silent, the constant chatter of the forest suddenly absent. Jonas noticed it first, his body tensing as the hairs on his neck prickled. Lila, busy stirring the broth, followed his gaze when she saw him freeze. Emerging from the tree line was a massive grizzly bear, its hulking form moving with a terrifying mix of grace and power. Its coat was dark, almost black, and its eyes, though distant, seemed fixed on the couple. At first, the bear sniffed the air, likely drawn by the scent of their cooking. Then it lumbered closer, each step heavy enough to stir the forest floor. Jonas and Lila knew better than to run. They stood motionless, their breaths shallow, trying not to appear threatening. Jonas had read countless warnings about bear behavior, Avoid eye contact, don't make sudden movements, and above all, never provoke it. But nothing could prepare him for the sheer size of the animal. The bear hesitated, its massive head swaying as it assessed the campsite. Jonas slowly reached for the bear spray clipped to his pack, while Lila inched backward toward the truck, parked about 30 yards away. Then, without warning, the bear's demeanor shifted. Its ears flattened, and it let out a deep, guttural growl that seemed to shake the air. The charge was sudden. With terrifying speed, the bear closed the gap, its claws swiping at Jonas before he could react. He staggered back, his left arm torn by the blow, blood soaking the sleeve of his flannel shirt. The pain was blinding, but adrenaline kept him on his feet. Lila screamed, breaking the bear's focus for a split second, and it turned its attention to her. The grizzly lunged at Lila with alarming force, knocking her to the ground. Her head struck a rock, and she went limp, unconscious, but still breathing. Fueled by desperation, Jonas grabbed the first thing within reach, the cast-iron frying pan resting on the fire. He charged the bear, swinging the pan with all his might. The first blow connected with the side of the bear's head, the metallic clang echoing through the clearing. The bear reared up, towering over him, its claws swiping dangerously close to his face. Jonas swung again, this time hitting its shoulder. But the bear was relentless. It lunged at him, its massive jaws snapping inches from his torso. Jonas stumbled back, narrowly avoiding another swipe, and swung again, hitting the bear squarely on the snout. The blow seemed to disorient it, but only for a moment. The bear roared an ear-splitting sound that sent shivers down Jonas's spine. It swiped at him again, sending the frying pan flying from his grip. Jonas fell hard onto his back, the wind knocked out of him. The bear loomed over him, its teeth bared and dripping with saliva. With no weapon and nowhere to run, Jonas did the only thing he could. He fought back with his bare hands. He kicked at the bear's chest, trying to keep it at bay, while his uninjured arm shielded his face. The bear's claws raked across his legs, tearing through fabric and flesh, but he kept struggling. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the bear stopped. It stood over him momentarily, breathing heavily, its dark eyes locked onto his. Jonas braced himself for another attack, but the bear gave a deep huff and turned away. It lumbered back toward the forest, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had come. For a few seconds, Jonas lay there, stunned and disoriented. His entire body ached, and blood seeped from multiple wounds, but his mind focused on one thing: Lila. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his arm and legs, and staggered toward her. She was still unconscious, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Blood matted her hair where she had struck the rock, and claw marks marred her side. Jonas checked her pulse, relief flooding him when he felt its faint rhythm. Summoning every ounce of strength, Jonas dragged Lila toward the truck. Each step was agony, his injured legs threatening to buckle under the weight. When he finally reached the vehicle, he laid her across the back seat and climbed into the driver's seat, his vision swimming. The forest blurred as he drove down the narrow dirt road, one hand gripping the wheel while the other pressed against the bleeding gash on his arm. It felt like hours before he reached the nearest ranger station, where he collapsed from exhaustion. Help arrived swiftly. Emergency responders airlifted both Jonas and Lila to a hospital, where surgeons worked through the night to treat their injuries. Jonas's arm required dozens of stitches, and his legs bore scars that would last a lifetime. Lila's injuries were more severe, a fractured skull and deep lacerations, but she survived. Her recovery was slow, but wildlife officials tracked the grizzly bear officials using reports of the attacks, tranquilized it, and relocated deeper into the wilderness, far from human habitation. The officials determined the bear was likely hungry and agitated, its aggression triggered by the scent of food. Jonas and Lila never returned to that campsite, but the experience changed them forever. The scars etched into their bodies constantly reminded them of the encounter, proof of a moment that had reshaped their lives in ways they could never forget. The Great Smoky Mountains seemed timeless and serene, cloaked in their ever-present veil of mist. The dense forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the soft hum of the wild echoing through the trees. Ezra Vance, a man in his late 30s, walked steadily along a narrow trail that wound through the wilderness. He had come here for solitude, to immerse himself in the raw beauty of nature and escape the noise of daily life. Beside him trotted his constant companion, Finn, a German shepherd with an unyielding loyalty that matched Ezra's quiet determination. Ezra was familiar with the outdoors. His pack was well stocked with supplies, and his walking stick, smooth from years of use, helped steady him on the uneven terrain. The day had been uneventful, the peaceful trek he had envisioned. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting shifting patterns of gold on the forest floor. Birds flitted between branches, and the faint rustle of squirrels in the underbrush added to the symphony of the woods. Finn bounded ahead, his nose low to the ground, tail wagging in excitement. By late afternoon it had cooled, and the shadows had grown longer. Ezra noticed signs of larger animals, a broken sapling, claw marks on a tree, but thought little of it. Black bears were known to inhabit the area, but were typically shy, avoiding humans whenever possible. Still, he remained vigilant, scanning the trail and keeping Finn close. He had no intention of surprising anything that might see him as a threat. It happened as he rounded a sharp bend in the trail. A black bear, massive and muscular, stood no more than 50 feet away, its dark eyes locked onto Ezra. Finn stopped in his tracks, his ears erect, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ezra froze, gripping his walking stick tightly. The bear didn't move at first, its head cocked slightly as it assessed the intruders. Ezra's mind raced through the steps he had learned for bear encounters. Don't run, don't turn your back, appear non-threatening. The bear began to circle slowly, its powerful body gliding over the uneven ground with unnerving ease. Finn barked sharply, his stance rigid, but the bear ignored him. Ezra took a step back, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then, without warning, the bear charged. The speed was shocking. One moment, the bear was circling. The next, it was barreling toward them, its jaws wide and its claws tearing into the dirt. Ezra raised his walking stick as the bear collided with him, the impact sending him sprawling to the ground. The stick splintered in his hands as the bear swiped at him, its claws raking across his legs and back. Pain exploded through him, but adrenaline kept him moving. He kicked at the bear's snout, trying to create space, but the animal was relentless, its growls deep and guttural. The bear's weight pinned him, its breath hot and rank against his face. Ezra thrashed beneath it, his mind a blur of fear and determination. Finn lunged as the bear reared back, preparing to strike his head. The dog's teeth sank into the bear's hind leg, and a savage snarl erupted from Finn's throat. The bear whipped around, momentarily distracted, swiping at Finn with its massive paw. The dog danced out of reach, barking furiously, his body a blur of movement as he darted around the bear. Ezra seized the moment. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he pushed himself to his knees and then to his feet. Blood soaked his torn clothing, and every step sent agony shooting through his body, but survival drove him forward. He shouted, waving his arms, trying to appear as large as possible to the bear. Finn continued his assault, biting and snapping at the bear's hindquarters, keeping its attention divided. Finally, the bear hesitated, its ears flicking back and forth as it gauged the threats. It huffed loudly, a sound of frustration and warning, before dropping to all fours and retreating into the underbrush. Finn barked after it, but Ezra called him back with a sharp whistle. The dog trotted to his side, his fur bristling, and his eyes alight with adrenaline. Ezra's legs trembled as he leaned heavily on what remained of his walking stick. Blood oozed from deep gashes on his thighs and back, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Finn stood by his side, his muzzle smeared with the bear's blood but otherwise unharmed. The two of them were alive, though battered, and that was enough. Ezra knew they couldn't stay there. The bear could return, or worse, the scent of blood might draw other predators. His eyes swept over the forest, searching for options. He remembered the small cabin he'd passed earlier that day, tucked near a stream less than a mile back. It wasn't far, under normal circumstances, but in his current state, weakened and aching, it felt like a journey of 100 miles. Still, there was no choice. Survival demanded they move. With Finn at his side, Ezra began the slow, agonizing trek back down the trail. Every step was a test of endurance, his wounds stinging and his head spinning from blood loss. Finn seemed to sense his weakness, staying close and nudging him forward whenever he faltered. The sun dipped lower, the forest dimming around them, but finally, the cabin came into view. Its weathered wood and stone chimney had never seemed so inviting. Staggering to the door, Ezra pounded on it with his strength. A couple of hikers inside answered, their faces pale with shock at the sight of him. They acted quickly, helping him inside and tending to his wounds. They cleaned the gashes with antiseptic and wrapped them in gauze, doing their best to stabilize him until help could arrive. Finn lay at his feet, his body pressed against Ezra's, his eyes never leaving his owner. Hours later, emergency responders arrived, alerted by a call from the hikers. Ezra was carried out on a stretcher, Finn following close behind. The dog's tail wagged faintly, almost as if he sensed the danger had passed. The paramedics praised Finn, calling him a hero, though Ezra, too weak to respond, could only offer a faint smile and gratitude. At the hospital, Ezra underwent surgery to repair the damage to his legs and back. The bear's claws had come dangerously close to severing a major artery, and the doctors marveled at his survival. Finn stayed with him during his recovery, his presence a constant reminder of the bond they shared and the loyalty that had saved Ezra's life. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth as Laurel Baines set off for her usual jog. She followed a winding trail that snaked through the dense woods outside her small Oregon town. This routine had become a source of peace for her, a daily ritual that offered solitude and a chance to connect with nature. Laurel was an experienced trail runner, and the surrounding forest was like a second home. It was quiet this time of year, with only the occasional rustle through the trees or the chirp of distant birds. The world around her seemed to blur into a patchwork of muted greens and browns as she ran. The damp soil gave way softly beneath her feet, muffling her strides. Her thoughts wandered in rhythm with her breathing. The woods were alive, but their life felt distant and unthreatening. She was confident here, accustomed to the occasional deer darting across her path or the sound of squirrels skittering up trees. Still, Laurel had always been mindful of her surroundings, carrying a whistle and a canister of bear spray clipped to her waist. These were precautions more than necessities, something she had seldom needed. The trail twisted sharply ahead, rounding a bend where a steep embankment loomed to her left and thick undergrowth pressed in from the right. The sunlight filtered weakly through the towering Douglas firs, creating patches of shadow that danced along the forest floor. It was here, at the edge of an unseen boundary, that Laurel's routine collided with something far more primal. The attack came without warning. From the undergrowth to her right, a massive bear lunged, its speed defying its size. Before Laurel could react, the animal's bulk slammed into her, knocking her off her feet and sending her sprawling onto the damp ground. The air rushed from her lungs as she landed hard on her side. The weight of the bear pinned her down almost instantly, and her mind reeled with shock and disbelief. The bear was enormous, its coat a dark, matted mass of muscle and fur. Its eyes were small but fierce, glinting with a predatory focus. This was not a startled animal's defensive aggression, but a predator's calculated attack. Laurel tried to scream, a guttural, instinctive sound that tore through the quiet forest. Her arms flailed as she struggled beneath the bear's immense weight, but it swiped at her with a massive paw, claws raking across her torso with devastating precision. The pain was blinding, a searing explosion that radiated through her body. She reached for the bear spray at her waist, her trembling fingers fumbling with the clasp. The bear lunged forward before she could free it, its jaws closing around her shoulder. The pressure was unbearable, teeth puncturing muscle and bone with horrifying ease. Laurel thrashed wildly, her survival instincts kicking in despite the overwhelming pain. She clawed at the bear's face, her nails scraping against its rough fur, but her efforts only seemed to enrage it further. Blood soaked into the ground beneath her, mingling with the damp earth. Her mind screamed to fight and survive, but her strength waned. The bear reared up slightly, its paw striking her head with enough force to blur her vision. The world tilted and spun, shadows growing darker around the edges of her sight. A sound pierced through the chaos from somewhere distant, a frantic, crashing noise that grew louder by the second. Another presence was approaching, feet pounding against the trail. The bear's ears twitched, and it paused, its attention momentarily diverted. A man, a fellow hiker drawn by Laurel's screams, burst into the clearing, He was shouting, his arms waving wildly to scare the animal away. The bear hesitated, its predatory instinct wrestling with the sudden intrusion. With one final guttural growl, it released Laurel and lumbered back into the undergrowth, vanishing as abruptly as it had appeared. The forest fell silent again, save for the ragged sound of Laurel's breathing and the frantic footsteps of her would-be rescuer. The hiker dropped to his knees beside her, his face pale as he took in the extent of her injuries. Blood pooled around her, staining the ground in dark patches. Her torso was torn open, deep gashes revealing muscle and tissue. Her shoulder was mangled, the bones shattered where the bear's jaws had clamped down. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling from blood loss and shock. The man frantically tried to help, his hands trembling as he attempted to stanch the bleeding with his jacket. He pressed against her wounds, his efforts desperate but futile. He checked for a pulse, found it faint but present, and began administering CPR when her breathing faltered. Laurel's chest rose and fell weakly under his hands, but her eyes remained closed, her consciousness slipping further away with each passing moment. Paramedics arrived minutes later, summoned by a call the hiker had managed to place in the chaos. They worked swiftly, stabilizing Laurel as best they could before loading her onto a stretcher. Her battered body was rushed to the nearest hospital, where a team of surgeons awaited. The severity of her injuries left no room for error. Hours passed as the doctors fought to repair the damage, their hands moving with practiced precision to stitch together torn flesh and set shattered bones. Despite their efforts, the toll had been too great. Laurel's body succumbed to the trauma, her pulse fading until it ceased entirely. The operating room fell silent, the steady beep of the heart monitor replaced by a hollow stillness. News of the attack spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the small community. Wildlife authorities later confirmed the bear's behavior as predatory, a rare but devastating phenomenon. They searched the area, setting traps and using tracking dogs to locate the animal. Though bears were a common sight in the region, such an attack was virtually unheard of, and its predatory nature raised alarm among experts. Laurel's death served as a grim reminder of the wild's unpredictability. Wild, a stark contrast to the beauty she had so often sought in its embrace. The trail where she had run every morning was temporarily closed, marked by signs warning of the danger. Her loss was deeply felt, a life stolen too soon by a force as old and unforgiving as nature itself.